Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. Really excited to have you joining us today. Please like, share, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts if you enjoy listening to our podcast or watching us on YouTube. We're in the heart of May right now. Seniors, you've probably started celebrating. Parents of seniors, I'm sure you probably have started celebrating. This can be one of the busiest months kind of ever for juniors. So juniors, my heart goes out to you. Parents of juniors, same thing. Today's show has segments really for both audiences. In the second half of the show, we're going to be talking about making the transition to college, really the nuts and bolts stuff from both the admissions and the finance side of things. But before we get to that, we're going to do a segment that personally I always find kind of fun. It's directed squarely at juniors and anyone else who's going to be doing college visits in the next few months. And this is really what not to ask or say to an admissions officer during those visits. And joining me is probably one of my favorite colleagues to have this kind of conversation with, because both of us are very opinionated. Jen Simons, who works here with me at College Coach, but also happens to be a former admissions officer at Tufts, Northeastern, Barnard, and Connecticut College, which, in case you're wondering, means that she's answered a lot of questions in her career. I answered questions when I was at Penn, so probably not as many, but I think we're a good combo to tackle this topic. Jen, hit me with maybe your least favorite question to get when you were an admissions officer, if you had one.
I think that it would generally come from a parent, and I'm just going to be honest, it was usually the father that would come up to me after like an information session or maybe before and say, so I know, why should I choose your college? Like, I know what you just said, but why, like, tell us like why we should come here.
Right. Right. How can you tell them that, right?
I know. I don't know. And maybe you shouldn't.
100%. It's a bit antagonistic, I think, in the way that that's worded. Personally, I agree. I never loved that question, but I would always flip it and I would say, I can't tell you why you should come here. All I could tell you is more about the school. I can answer any specific questions that you have, but that's a choice that you have to make, right? And I think for me, the big thing with that is this shouldn't be an antagonistic situation. And if you ask a question kind of like that, maybe you don't mean it to be antagonistic. Maybe it's a dad thing. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's a mom thing or a student thing. And it's sort of like, well, you sell me on who you are.
Yeah.
But if you don't know them, right, how can you sell them? What did you used to say?
Well, I think that I will answer that question, but I think the problem is, if it's also a problem, is that it used to be like in the olden days, like a very distinct relationship. Like, maybe people considered us like salespeople to some extent, like representing a school, but it was more formal. I think as everything has gotten, as people have gotten more accessible on social media, and we have things like blogs that really, like, the goal is to show not only the personality of the school, but maybe your personality as an admissions officer. You look at these websites and it's like, you can learn what my favorite book is, and you can learn, so people sort of feel that they know you. And at the same time, they don't. And it's also a formal relationship in that you are potentially going to be making a decision about them and evaluating them. It's a sort of odd, it's an odd relationship that doesn't exist elsewhere. But I would say the same thing. Like, I would be like, I don't, like, okay. So I also had to get to a point in my career where I did have a little bit of an elevator speech of like, okay, here's why you should choose Tufts.
Sure.
Like, I don't think that people are satisfied, no offense, with your kind answer. I think they need to know, like, you should choose Tufts because you want to be outside, just outside a major metropolitan area, and you want to be able to do engineering or arts and sciences, weave them both together. Like, you have to, because it's not satisfying to come so far away. And I maybe haven't done a good job in my information session if you're asking me, so why us? But I also recognize it was the same parent that would come up to me and be like, so is Tufts tough? Like they're just trying to like bond with you and connect with you so then you could have a conversation. So
Yeah, I agree. And I might flip it back on them, but yes, I agree. I did have things that I would say that I thought I liked the version of that question that I didn't mind, which it really is a similar question. It was sort of like the can you give me some key reasons that you think make Penn
mhm.
a really good choice? Or, think just a little bit less phrased a little bit differently. And I think, for our listeners, just think about how you phrase something, right? I don't think it's a bad thing to ask an admissions officer, what do you think, if you were asked to identify the 3 important things about your school, what would they be? That's totally appropriate. But to say, why should I come here?
Yeah.
That one's a little not great, right?
Yeah. And I always encourage students, I say you want to ask subjective questions that are going to require an opinion. Granted, you're getting someone's opinion. So obviously you don't want to ask things that can be found on the website. You don't want to ask if they accept, 4s and 5s on APs or what their standardized testing policy is, unless it's just changed and there are some nuances or,
Right.
whatever. It's perfectly nice to say, what is your absolute favorite thing about, this university? What's your favorite tradition? What kind of student wouldn't be happy here? I actually sort of like that question. Like
Yes.
who might not find this to be a good home for the next 4 years? Like something like that. I think those sort of speculative questions. Now it's the same thing a little bit as asking like the server at a restaurant what meal they recommend. And then when they recommend something that you don't like, you're just like, oh, wait a minute. Is this just, is this really a bad dish? Like, should I not order it? Or is it just my preference? And so I think to some extent you're asking someone's opinion, so you have to take it with a grain of salt, right? So
Right.
it shouldn't let you define the whole school. But I love those sort of fun questions, like, what was a memory, like what's something that you can remember, from this past year that was really meaningful to you on campus or something
Right.
like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I always liked, I got a few times sort of like, hey, can you tell us, is there, it's a double-edged sword. I'm gonna say it and then I'm gonna regret saying it. But like, was there an essay that you read that
Yes.
you thought was particularly compelling? The double-edged sword of that for our listeners is that every essay has got to be unique to the student. And so sometimes if you give an example, people latch on to it and then try to recreate, the student tries to recreate that same concept. And I think that's a little bit tricky, but I agree with you. Like, love the kind of open-ended, a little bit more thoughtful questions. Probably one of my least favorite questions was alongside the one you started with, but was also like, do you have a good program in X? Do you have a good program in biology? Do you have a good program in physics? Do you have a good program in English? Uh, you know,
What is your English department like? I mean, like, we're generalists in admissions, so it's not my job to know every little thing about the English department, but I'm also not going to tell you it's not a good,
right.
department. Like that's so you're not really getting like what you need. Like it's our English department is one of the largest departments and you can do creative writing as a concentration. Like you can sort of pick up, but one of my best bits of advice is, and I know this is hard because chances are you're going to like 10 schools in a week with your family, especially with the summer coming up. Maybe your, parent has created a whole itinerary for you. But if to the extent that you can sit in the car or on the plane or wherever and do a little bit of research so that you can ask a better question. So instead of, is your English department good? It can be like, can I have a concentration in Shakespeare in the English department, or do I have to know another language? You know what I mean? Like if that's really what you're interested in, and they might not know the answer because again, they're generalists but it's their job to tell you how to find out, to put you in touch with someone, to get back in touch with you with the answer. So that is an impressive question that shows that you know about the school a little bit.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also think one thing you could is think about who is your audience, because as you said, an admissions officer is a generalist, not a specialist. So it might be appropriate, maybe you looked online and you couldn't figure out who in the English department you could connect with.
Yeah.
Your admissions officer may not be able to give you a name right then and there, but they might be able to go back to the main area where everyone met, get a name and leave it for you, or come find you and give it to you, or email it to you, so that you can connect with that person and ask the right person all of those deep dive questions, right? So if you do have questions about specific departments, there's someone in that department, I guarantee you, who will be very open and would love to answer your questions, because it's their department. It's the thing they love and the thing they're most attached to. But when you ask an admissions officer a question like that, is it a good department? Like you said, what are you going to say? No, I hear it's terrible. Of course not.
Yeah.
And again, I want to get back to like, what's good? What does good mean to you?
To you.
Right? And that's the key. And that's the thing that I think as a student and as parents of students, sometimes we lose sight of, which is you're not going to this school so they can tell you everything that's amazing about the school, because guaranteed that's what they're going to do. Your goal is to find out, is this an amazing choice for me? And the only way to do that is to really be more thoughtful about, what do I want? And then fashion questions that can help you find out if they have those things.
Absolutely. And making like differentiating between questions you'll ask a student tour guide and a professional admissions officer, even if that admissions officer is an alum, unless they're a really recent alum, I think that you have to really differentiate. You also have to differentiate between questions that you'll ask as a visitor, determining whether to apply, and as a student determining whether to enroll if you've been accepted, so there are sort of micro questions that are actually really, really good questions to get into after you've been accepted. And they're necessary because they might change your decision, those nitty gritty questions. And then there are questions that you should ask just to sort of establish whether or not you want to apply to begin with. So I would get frustrated sometimes when students would ask very, 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 very micro questions.
Can you think
and
of
they
an
were,
example of what you mean by
oh,
that?
so, okay. So I understand you have a good pre-health program. Do you know approximately how many hours the pre-health advisor is going to work with the students, and, who is going to write the recommendations? Are they going to be a committee? I mean, that's actually a question I could answer, but like those sort of like, so how many hours, like how often would I expect to meet with I don't know, that just felt like the pre-health advisor, not like
Right.
overall, like that might be a question when you're comparing apples to apples of schools you've been accepted to. That might change your decision, but it's not, is that going to impact whether you apply? Maybe, I don't know, but
Right. I would say it's rare that students get that. You're right, that sort of deep dive. Like, it's not a bad question, but I think again, it's probably the better question of your admissions officer is, I know you have a great pre-health advising department. Is there someone in that department that I could talk to? Because I have some very nitty gritty questions that I really want to ask, right? I think that, if you really are that kid or that parent that's going to do that deep dive before you have your choices in front of you, just again, it's important to recognize who's the person who's going to be best suited to answer that question. Because I could tell you that Penn had pre-health advising, but if the rest of it came my way, I personally would not have been able to answer that.
Yeah. And I think it's perfectly okay to ask questions that maybe aren't going to allow the admissions officer or the tour guide to present the college in the most shiny light. Like, it's perfectly okay to say,
Yes.
what would you change about
Yes.
Penn? What would you change about Tufts? And if it's a student, like from your experience, is there anything you wish you had done differently? Like, that's perfectly fine. I think you get a nuanced, perspective of the school, but I think it's hard for like on the spot. And usually there's a line of other parents parents and students like out the door waiting to ask
Right.
you questions. And you're just like, I don't know how many hours, like, or whatever.
Well, it's
So
100%. And I also think, to your point, if you're going to do the tour, which hopefully you will, your tour guide could be a good person to ask.
yeah.
Understanding, take it with a little bit of a grain of salt, because this student and you, or the student and your child, may not see eye to eye on just about anything. But right, if your admissions officer is employed by the university, if they have an issue with parties on Saturday nights, they're not really gonna get into that with you. The
Right.
tour guide might. So if this is something that you're really concerned about, that's probably a better question for a tour guide than maybe for the admissions officer.
Absolutely. And the best people too, if you can, and if you know them, I know this is going off topic a little bit, is to find your own resources that are not necessarily employed by the admissions office after you start there. So your friend that, from high school that graduated 2 years before you did, like ask them sort of for more of the insider scoop.
Yeah, the student experience, exactly. And I think it
Oh,
goes
not the
back to,
admissions. Don't ask admissions questions of anyone that, yes, absolutely.
yes, right. They have, if your neighbor is about to tell you how they got into X school and you should follow what they told you, you might be heading down the wrong path if you do that. But as we kind of wrap this up, I think we've done hopefully a good job of sort of sharing some key things of not only what not to ask, but also maybe things that you could ask instead, or people who you could ask instead of your admissions officer. I want to highlight your point about if you can find it online, I wouldn't ask about it. If it's some factual stuff that's right there in the website, if you've looked and you couldn't find it, I think that's totally fine to ask. And I think it's fine to ask about the nuance of something, right? What are your average SAT scores? Not a question I would ever ask an admissions officer. I see that you've been test optional for the past 2 years. Do you think this will continue? Do you have advice on when to submit, when not to submit? Those are good questions, right? Those are you're going to pull some good info, or you should anyway, out of your admissions officer. Any other thoughts in terms of a question you wish someone would reframe, or a question you wish they would ask, or that they wouldn't ask?
I think you triggered it, like advice. I love it when you said advice. What is your advice about whatever it is? Like, what is your advice for someone who is applying? Like, I think it's, you take it out of the, what was your favorite essay that you've read or what has worked, into what advice would you give me if I was to write a successful essay for the school?
Yep. Yep. I love it. This was less, I thought we would be coming up left and right with, oh, I hate this question, I hate that question. But I think at the core of it is that we both have really enjoyed our time as admissions officers, and we enjoy our time doing this part. So it's less that you really do get so many terrible questions or things that you wish people wouldn't ask, and more that you just wish they would maybe reframe it a little sometimes. Or just think about it a little bit more before you go to the college campuses. Jen, thank you so much for coming and joining the show. A little bit of a last minute request, so I really appreciate it.
I'm always happy to be on. Thank you so much. Great to see you.
You too. All right, we're going to take a really quick break. And when we come back, we're going to be talking all about the transition from high school to college. So don't go away.